Tell you what, it really is wonderful to be outside, isn't it? And to be in a group outside. We've gone through a lot in the last 2 years. Wanted to know, for everything that we went through, how many of you guys went hiking? Yes. A lot of people went hiking over these last 2 years, but there's a couple things to start out with. First of all, I'd like to thank the Rancho Mirage Public Library and Observatory. I'd like to thank the Rancho Mirage Public Library and Observatory Foundation. Without the foundation, activities, and if you've gone to any of the library activities, any of the events, they're all put together by the foundation. Obviously, the staff does an amazing job, but I'll let you in on a little secret. The secret is this: without an audience, you have absolutely nothing. And so I appreciate you that you're here. You took some time to come in the middle of the day, and the weather it's pretty amazing. You look at the rest of the United States, and I think we made a wise choice being out here. Let me tell you a little bit about, I've always done with the Rancho Mirage Public Library and Observatory film, documentaries, foreign language films, and I've been bugging Aaron and the crew for a long time about actually talking about hiking. And coming out of COVID, Aaron approached and TJ, and they said, I think it's time. I think that everyone, at least in the last 2 years, has found their ability to be outside, and maybe a program like this would be fun. I'll tell you this on a personal level. For the last 7 years, not counting the last 2, I've taken a program, a desert program, through Palm Springs Unified and through Desert Sands. And it was a 9-week course about flora and fauna and history of the desert and geology. And I already noticed the difference between you and 4th grade kids. 4th grade kids, you hold up a snake and the little kid raises their hand and goes, "Oh, can I talk about my puppy dog?" You guys I appreciate you guys. So, but we were going to talk about Murray Peak, and there's a couple things I want to let you know ahead of time. The very first thing is I am a humble hiker. I've been out here since 1975 when I could climb over the fence and drive my mom crazy as I was disappearing out into the desert, which probably wasn't a smart thing to do. And I know being grounded multiple times, it was not a smart thing to do. But all through that journey, I continuously spent my time as much as I could outside. This is an extraordinary area. But the things that I need to let you know is this. The things that I've learned over the course of my lifetime, I am not a scientist. I am not a geologist. I am not, I appreciate history. I love to revel in it. I am not considered a historian. What I have been able to do over the course of my life is to Palm Springs Life magazine and the Desert magazine and going to museums. I just accumulated as much as I could because for me, when I go on a trail, there's 2 parts for me that I enjoy. One is the journey. I don't like being the fast hiker because I want to take in everything that's around me. And the second thing is I ponder to myself, okay, this trail is called Murray. Why is it called Murray? This trail is on a mountain. How did this mountain get here? There's a snake. What kind of snake is it? And so over all these years and hiking all these trails, I've just compiled as much as I possibly could to understand our unique and wonderful valley. I wanted to clarify that because things that I'll share to you, it's possible that, you say, Jason, okay, you're close on your date, but it should be 1875. Okay, the way we learn is through our mistakes. When we don't learn, it means that we've shut off our mind and we're standing still and don't want anything else to come in. I do. So if there are certain things that you're just kind of scratching your head, let's talk about it. The second thing is what I'm going to share with you today. If you ever want to take that journey to Murray Peak, if you click on the event through the library to the website, it'll get you to my page. And I have no problem sending you the GPX file if you've learned how to use your phone to guide you around with the GPX file. But that's a little later on. So what I want to start out is this. A little bit of who I am, and I'm hoping that, I think that slide just came up. When my family brought me out here in 1975, I lived at the beach. I was 5 years old. The desert to me was watching the Roadrunner and Coyote, and there were some cactus in there, and there was a canyon, and there was desert. And then I came out here, and it was a little bit of a shell shock, to be honest with you. Growing up the beach, it was nice to hang in the waves and stuff. It wasn't until when I was about 8 years old, my mom took me to a place called Cabot's Museum up in Desert Hot Springs. And if you've never been there, it's very odd. There's 35 rooms, 65 doors, 140 windows, stands 4 stories tall, built by the gentleman, Cabot Yerxa, who discovered the hot mineral water in Desert Hot Springs. And I went on a tour. And at the end of the tour, I told my mom, I really like this, I want to come back. And she talked to, at that time, the owner, Cole Erod, and she said, can he do something? And Cole looked at me and said, there's a broom over there, he can start sweeping. Well, in about 6 weeks, I was giving tours. And the wonderful thing about those tours at that museum was we talked about earthquake faults, because the hot water in Desert Hot Springs, one side of the earthquake fault, Mission Creek, had hot water. The other side had cold water divided out through there. We talked about the environment that what Cabot came into in 1913, which was desert and the snakes and things like that. And I loved all of that. And so talking about that tour until I retired at the age of 11 inspired me to really just grab hold of this desert and see the beauty for it. Years later, as an adult, as I mentioned before, went through a lot of the school districts and did these wonderful, fun programs until COVID hit, but we're all coming back. But what I did keep going, as many of you raised your hand on, is I kept hiking. And 8 years ago, I started a group in Rancho Mirage. Has anybody been on the trails behind Rancho Mirage City Hall? If you haven't, they're really neat. You got to walk a little bit on the road up to the Ritz and watch out for those that are doing happy hour in the evening. But it's a great trail. It's a 3-mile loop. And we've been doing that Monday through Thursday every single morning for years. And we kept it going during COVID. And I'll tell you what, hikers are amazing people. First of all, any hiker who can get up at 4 o'clock in the morning to be at a location at 5:30 in the morning, I can tell you this much, they're not happy. Not happy for the first 10 minutes. But there's something magical as you're walking with a group and you start seeing the glow of the sky. And you see the sunrise, and no matter how the rest of your day goes, you have that to start with. And that really got a lot of us through COVID. So it's been a really fun adventure getting into adulthood and staying connected to the trails. I'm going to talk to you about Murray Peak and the trail up there, but I'm going to be very honest with you. If we did a lecture just on the trail of Murray Peak, we would be out of here in about 5 minutes. So we're going to take a journey. And the way this journey works is I'm going to share a portion of the trail, and anytime that we're climbing in elevation, usually, not everybody, there's a point where we take a break. And in that moment of taking a break, we're going to talk a little bit about Wellwood Murray. We're going to talk a little bit about the flora and fauna out here. We're going to talk a little bit about how old these mountains are back here. And hopefully that makes it fun on this journey to Murray. But we're going to start out with the Coachella Valley. The Coachella Valley, which is 45 miles long and about 15 miles wide in its widest point. It is captured in this valley with, you can see our San Jacinto over here. Can't see San Gorgonio, but those two peaks, San Gorgonio is the tallest peak in Southern California, 11,504 feet. Yeah. And San Jacinto, which is the 5th highest peak in the Coachella Valley, is at 10,834 feet. And that starts in that Cabazon kind of area we call the wind tunnel. And it moves down this way. As it moves down this way, and you can see a little bit over to the side over here, we have the Santa Rosa Mountains. Santa Rosa Mountains head all the way to La Quinta and pass down La Quinta just before they end at the Anza Borrego, the Borrego Desert. To the back side of us, we have the other side, which is behind Desert Hot Springs and Indio Hills, and that's the Little San Bernardinos. And then you kind of go, if you took a very long swim, you could jump into the Salton Sea. Why? I don't know. But you could go about a quarter of the way down, and that's where the Coachella Valley ends at. What's amazing about this is we are, in total, 9 cities and 12 unincorporated areas. They include the unincorporated areas, Thousand Palms, Bermuda Dunes. And in the summertime, in July, we're about 200,000 people that are living here year-round. In January, we're about almost 800,000 people. And then when you figure in the tennis gardens and you're figuring in all these concerts and stuff, we can swell up through an entire year of visitors of almost 3 million people. That's a lot of people. And then when you figure out that you're looking at that portion of the land through there, is that in that valley, there's private land, there's federal land, there's public land, there's part of the tribal area through here, and you look at all that and you wonder, how could there be anything left to actually enjoy in nature? And what's amazing is that over the last 30 years, 40 years, some wonderful things have happened. The first thing is, I know some people don't like the little lizard, the fringe-toed lizard. But because of that little lizard, we have a beautiful central park in our Coachella Valley. If you think about it, if you drive out towards Thousand Palms, in that Thousand Palms area, there's a whole section of land that has been set aside for the fringe-toed lizard. But that land that's been set aside is also, with Thousand Palms growing and Palm Desert heading out through that way, and then the back area with Desert Hot Springs, and you have Sky Valley, is that eventually you'll have this area that will be left natural, right on the San Andreas Fault. Don't know why anybody would want to build their home on the San Andreas Fault, but the good news, at least in that area, will remain desert. You have Joshua Tree National Park, which is just, I mean, literally, if you look towards Desert Hot Springs, right where the Little San Bernardinos rise out, that is Joshua Tree National Park. Comes actually all the way down to the bottom of the Little San Bernardinos. Behind us, we have the Sand to Snow Monument. In total, 280,000 acres. Those 280,000 acres were set aside on October 24th, 2000. And Congress set aside the property, and Clinton signed it. And so what we're blessed with here in the Coachella Valley is no matter how this grows down here, we're going to see these mountains. We're going to see these hills. We're going to be able to visit the Coachella Valley Preserve, and we will always understand that if we're stuck here in the summertime and it's 120 degrees outside, that we still live in a desert. Doesn't happen too much in San Bernardino. Doesn't happen too much in Riverside because most of that area has been built up. As I mentioned before in our program, I'm going to share a little bit about Murray Peak, and then we'll continue on with these little topics in between. So let's go ahead and start out with Murray Peak. It's a little hard for me to show you along through here because I would have had the pointer, but if you look at this map, and you see this kind of finger sticking down this way, that's Cathedral Canyon. See Cathedral City on the map? On the other side is Palm Springs. That little finger sticking down through there, if you kind of, as a crow flies on the edge of that and you start making your way over to Palm Springs, over those hills, that's where Murray Peak's at. We can't see it from here because where Thunderbird is at, right around the corner, those hills rise up above that. But Murray Peak, if you were in Cathedral City, especially in the area of Trader Joe's, and you looked up to the top, you could see Murray Peak. It is not the highest peak in the Santa Rosa National Monument. That goes to Toro Peak, and Toro Peak sits at approximately 8,716 feet. Murray Peak, and people go back and forth on it, we'll just set it at somewhere between 21 to 2,200 feet in elevation. Very prominent. The national monument that was created through that area, which protects that, is all lined out in the green. Part of it is managed by the Bureau of Land Management, which is the lower portion of the desert. The upper portion is managed by the Forest Service. I looked and looked and looked for a picture of the individual I want to talk about next because he is very connected, in a sense, to Murray Peak, as well as the naming of Cathedral City. His name was Colonel Henry Washington. He was actually the nephew of George Washington. And so when California became a state, what we inherited was a bunch of Spanish maps. And it was his job, starting in 1852, just above the Coachella Valley and the San Bernardino Redlands and all on that area out through there, was to take the maps and start surveying them and renaming them for the United States. In 1855, he was brought back out here specifically for what we now call the Coachella Valley. And he went into Cathedral Canyon, and he looked up into those hills, which Murray Peak would have been prominent through there, and he said, this reminds me of cathedrals. And he wrote on the map Cathedral Mountains. Cathedral City got its name from that ID coming back all the way to Colonel Henry Washington. All right, looking at Murray Peak, you'll see a little green dot on that screen, I hope. And you'll see a bunch of what looks like little trails, roads heading up all around Murray Peak. How many people have ever climbed Murray Peak? Wonderful. There are a lot of different ways to go to Murray Peak. And I'll give you an example. We could start, if we're crazy, all the way down in Palm Desert on the Art Smith Trail. We could walk all the way on the someone's laughing, they must have done that. No, I'm teasing. Go all the way on the Art Smith Trail, go all the way up to the peak, and then turn all the way back home or go down Cathedral. You could do that. You could do that. That's the longest part of it. Or you could, that's the longest part of it. You could also take trails from Rimrock Shopping Center. So if you're familiar with the goat trails, you could make your way up through there and actually do the front portion of Murray Peak. That's very steep. You could jump over to the next portion, which is Araby, named Araby Cove area, where the Bob Hope House is at. You could walk up through there and take that direction from Murray Peak. You could go over to Bogart Trail. Bogart Trail is a nice little, once you get all the way up into the Cahuilla Hill community, park through there. It's probably one of the shorter, easier ways to get up to Murray Peak. You could pay to go into the tribal land over in Palm Canyon, and you could take a trail that takes you all the way up to Murray Peak that way. We are only focusing today on the GARSTIN Trail. But all these little trails that you see in this map right here, there was a group that came along in 1931, a group of people that decided that horse riding was the thing to do out here in the desert. And they created the Desert Riders. What they did was they found a lot of the trails that the Agua Caliente had utilized over the years, that in the summertime they would travel up into the mountains, and in the wintertime they would come back down to the canyons. And these faint trails were just perfect for going back and horse riding in. And people like Carl Licken and Mr. Garstin, they developed these trails since 1931, and probably up until the 60s and 70s. They were very prominent in Palm Springs, over 28 trails. Most of the trails that you hike on in the Palm Springs area, Cathedral City area, a little bit behind Palm Desert, were all put together originally by the Desert Riders. Their primary area was in Palm Springs, and they would just ride out. So picture there of them. Our trail. So now we're getting closer to starting our trail, but the first thing that came to me years ago when I looked at this trail, and I just fascinated on how people come up with names for certain areas. And here was a trail that took you up to Murray Peak. And yet, there was not only a Murray Peak, there was a Murray Canyon. And not only there was a Murray Canyon, there was a Murray Cemetery. And not only there was a Murray Cemetery, but there was also Murray signs, street signs, and a Murray Library. Tells me that this Murray's a pretty popular guy. But who is he? And in order to understand Murray, you have to go this is a partnership. This partnership starts with John McCollum. And what happened was John was up in San Francisco. This would have been about 1875, 1874, and his son got tuberculosis. And in that situation of getting tuberculosis and being in San Francisco in the cold summers and the fog that was coming through, he knew that there was just no way his son could stay in that environment and survive. And so he decided to leave his business behind as a lawyer and transfer over into Los Angeles. And he became an Indian agent. But Los Angeles wasn't quite for his family either. The railroad had come through here starting around 1876. So in 1877, he transferred over to Beaumont, California. Banning, California, actually. Train station was set up through there. And Banning, believe it or not, was a hip place to be in 1875, 1876. And he settled in there. So what ended up happening was, as an Indian agent, his responsibility was through across the Coachella Valley. And there are a handful of tribes, the Mission Creek tribe, Torres Martinez, and the Agua Caliente, just to name a few. And he had a friend named Will Pablo, who was Native American, and told him he really should come and see some of the sites in these areas. And he convinced him to come down into what we now call Palm Springs. Back that time, it was called Palm Valley. And Palm Valley was not much of anything. The railroad had just come through just probably about 6-7 years before that period of time. The railroad station, if you're over on Indian Canyon Drive, where the new station that no one ever goes to, it used to be called Seven Palms. And they got off the train, they went down through this area, and there was a little spring in the area that is now the Spa Hotel. And this little spring had kind of warm water, and there was taquitos that was flowing down, and there seemed to be enough there that John could actually establish himself in this little place that was called Palm Valley. And he took the chance. He brought all 5 of his kids down, his wife, and they started to set up shop. It was hard, to say the least. They had to rework the Tahquitz water system. They worked on the Whitewater Creek area to bring water down through there, but his son was doing better. John had made friends with Dr. Wellwood Murray while he was in Banning. And I'm going to jump back to John in a second, but let's jump to Dr. Wellwood Murray. So Dr. Wellwood Murray had settled into Banning, California. He was actually not a recognized doctor in the sense that he went to college for that. He got involved in the Civil War, and he had a knack for putting people back together. And in that knack of putting people back together, those who survived affectionately called him doctor. Those who did not didn't call him doctor. But with that title of doctor, he was a very creative man, and he not only he could grasp the idea of a vision, he could put things together from that. And John had now already spent 2 years in this Palm Valley that he decided to rename as Agua Caliente, and John went back to Wellwood Murray, who was up in Banning, and he said, "Look, my son's doing great, and the weather out here is amazing in the wintertime. Summertime, not so amazing. But people should really know about this place. And they should know that if you have an ailment, if you're suffering with breathing issues, this is really, honestly, the place to be. But nobody wants to get off the train and walk 7 miles to basically over sand dunes to nothing. But I'll tell you what, there's this little hot springs here, and it is on tribal land. What would you think about, with your namesake and your creativity, of creating a spa, a hotel?" Dr. Wellwood Murray thought about it for a second, and he said, "I'll tell you what, I'll go on that train, we'll go down, we'll take a look at this." He went down, and he fell in love with it. This very barren place he fell in love with. And he was able to work out with the tribe a $100 lease. And in that $100 lease, he was able to build a 1-story building with a veranda that went all the way around it and held about 20 guests. He, through the water that was diverted down from Tahquitz, he planted citrus trees and pretty much, as you look in the pictures, everything that probably wouldn't grow in the desert. and he was able to establish this hotel. He was a gentleman who loved to read. And he actually built a separate little building that he put his books in, and whether it was tribal or whether it was his guests or some of the residents that were starting to settle in Palm Springs, they could check out a book anytime that they wanted to. He had a passion in that direction. And he was one of the founding members, founding fathers, if you take John in consideration and a few others, that started Palm Springs. So it seems fitting for an individual like that to have a name that is associated to a peak, to a canyon, to a cemetery, and to a library. The cemetery, interestingly enough, when his son passed away, he had 2 acres that is located over behind, it would be Coffee off of Chino Drive. Most people miss it. It's a little rock wall that rises up. There's actually a cemetery there, and his son is buried there, as well as many prominent past figures of Palm Springs. So now we had a chance to learn a little bit about Wellwood Murray, Dr. Wellwood Murray. So I think it's time for us to start our trail. What I'm going to tell you about the startup of this particular trail in GARSTIN is that out of all the areas that I suggested that you could start out, I think the conclusion is there's not an easy way up to get to Murray Peak. But what I would challenge people is to do this. Take a section, go as far as you can go. Enjoy it in the morning, don't do it in the afternoon. Slowly, surely, eventually, you might actually get up to the top. I have this wonderful program that when I map out my trails, it does 2 things for me. It gives me what we call a GPX file, which you can download and you can save, and that'll be your trail mapping guide from that point on. And then the other thing it does is it creates these really cool videos. So we're going to do each section as we travel up on these videos. So I'm going to start out first, this all works out, because once again, it's a little weird for me to look at it this way, is our starting point. Our starting point, with all the trails out here, some of them, when you drive out to, they're absolutely in the middle of nowhere, and there's nothing around it. There are other trails, though, that are right smack dab in the middle of community. This trail for GARSTIN is smack dab in the middle of community. It's Kauai Hills, which is an unincorporated area in Palm Springs. Rule etiquette to me is that when you're parking in somebody's neighborhood, you're not yelling, you're not screaming. Your dog is not running through their yard and doing other things. It is special that we have this opportunity to connect in at this trailhead, and I hope that we never lose this opportunity. So I always look at it when I'm parking in somebody's yard area, that I'm going to respect it as much as I would want respect back from them. It climbs really quickly. So if you're going to go down Palm Canyon Drive, South Palm Canyon Drive, as if you're heading over towards the Indian Canyons, you're going to see Bogart Trail. And Bogart Trail Road will take you down into the Kauai Hills area. Just before you make the turn up to continue up through there, there's a little street called Borona. Borona is a little cul-de-sac. You go to the end of the cul-de-sac, and the trail starts up there. So let me get you started. Jason Bruecks, and starting up to Murray Peak. Now, there are multiple locations to go up to Murray Peak, but we're starting off in Palm Springs, in the Kauai area back through here, off of Bogart. And this should be a journey. Can't even see Murray Peak from here. But we're starting up on the GARSTIN Trail, connect up to a couple other trails, and I'll be sharing this with you. All right, brief and short. But now we're ready to make that hike. I can tell you this, as you're climbing this very steep area, take lots of breaks. Because what's beautiful about this trail is that it's beautiful to turn around and look at the things that you see. You see San Jacinto. You're looking right down into the canyon that eventually goes up to Palm Canyon and the Indian Canyons through there. And no one should ever fault you for taking as many breaks as you want. I always tell people when they hike with me, if you don't like someone who's walking with you, either go faster or slower or take a stop. So take that as the same kind of rule. Take your breaks. But as you can see, as we're starting to go up this particular hill, it is a steep climb. When you get to the top of GARSTIN, it is It's actually very spectacular. You have a whole series of trails that connect in with Garstin. You have the Shannon Trail. You could connect in with Araby. You can connect in with the Goat Trails, WILDHORSE, eventually up to CLARA BURGESS, and it's quite stunning. And occasionally you'll see bighorn sheep through there, which brings me back to the point that there's almost no trails in Palm Springs that are dog friendly. For those who have their pooches and love to walk them, I know that probably sounds frustrating, but there are some amazing places to go hiking out with your dogs, including all the trails that are in Rancho Mirage. There are 5. Granted, 4 of them are all connected together. And there's Mission Creek and there's Whitewater, so there are places to walk your dogs. In Palm Springs, though, anything that's going up into a hill basically is not dog friendly. As we're walking up this hill, we're going to notice some changes. We're going from the low desert portion. Actually, we're in the Sonoran Desert, and we're in the Colorado portion, the Colorado lower desert portion of the Sonoran Desert. And through there, we see things like creosote on the desert floor down through your smoke trees and things like that. But as we start to climb up into the hillside, we're going to see more unusual things. For instance, Mojave yuccas. There are plenty of Mojave yuccas up there that are blooming. The hedgehog cactus, the calico hedgehog cactus, and those beautiful flowers that you see in the picture are blooming through there. You even have goat's nut. If you're not familiar with goat's nut, it's called jojoba. It's the same stuff that they put in a lot of shampoos. You find that up there. And of course, barrel cactus. Barrel cactus is the water cooler of spines. Not that I would ever want to drink it, but bighorn sheep, occasionally you'll see them and they're actually knocking into those barrel cactus and eating the pulpy juice that comes from that. So part of the plant life that we're seeing up there. We're ready, we've taken our break. Now we're ready to walk again. The great thing about this next section, which is the Garstin all the way up to WILDHORSE, going on to the WILDHORSE area, is that it's just a nice little cruise. So if you got yourself up to the top of Garstin Hill and it's not too hot, take a little bit of a walk. The bad news to that is that there's all these trails that kind of all commingle together. So you need to know where you're going, otherwise you're going to spend a nice portion of your day going in circles or ending up at the grocery store over at Rimrock. But in that beautiful area, there's a couple things that I'd noticed, and I really love. I love doing that section from Garstin over to Rimrock during a full moon, because once you're up on top of Garstin, it's just a nice little roll. What you'll notice as you're going up through that area and that flat area is that this seems to be a perfect catch for insects. I'm sorry, I will always be a 10-year-old boy for the rest of my life. But when I have gone up there, especially towards the end of September up until December the 1st, the male tarantulas are out there and they're like, hey, I'm looking for a honey. And it's like, well, just keep on going. The little spider creature that's right below it, this is something that people get confused all the time. It is not a spider, it's a solipuge, camel spider. It is not a vinegaroon. This is something that if you picked up, it has a really bad attitude. It will bite you. There is no venom. There is no poison to it. It has these weird jaws that open this way and open this way. But it is not venomous or it's poisonous. The one that's next to it, though, is a giant yellow hairy scorpion. Fortunately for most scorpions all across the world, they are nocturnal creatures, so unless you're picking up rocks, turning them over, you're probably not going to encounter a scorpion unless you're doing a full moon hike at night. Stink bugs, harvest ants right now are going crazy because with the flower blooms, the seeds are coming out and you have the black and the red harvest ants. That beautiful little butterfly is called a painted lady butterfly. I have been in that little section as I'm heading up to WILDHORSE, and if the flowers are blooming in April, I have seen thousands of these butterflies. They migrate from Mexico, go all the way up to the central state areas. I want to say Dakotas and so on and so forth as you're starting to work your way down. And these butterflies are extraordinary. And then you have this little red ant-looking thing. We call it a velvet ant, a buffalo ant. It's not an ant at all. It's actually a wingless wasp. So it's about that big, and its stinger is about that big. And it's like the 5th most painful sting creature that you can. So when I was younger, I picked up everything. I don't pick those up anymore. They're quite painful. But this is some of the things that you would see as you're going up on that particular trail. Okay, we've gotten to now Wild Horse over to CLARA BURGESS Trail. This is where we're going to start climbing again. In that process of climbing, I'm going to back this up for a second. The very first thing is we're greeted to a sign, which indicates that we're going to start making our next section. This portion of the trail has been abused, and this portion of the trail has eroded. Abused because I am a passionate hiker. I do ride a bicycle. I do not ride a bicycle on a trail. There are people that do, and that's good. I'm glad that they're out there. But sometimes riding super fast and cutting corners and things like that have really eroded trails. And the beginning portion of this trail, as you're starting to make up the next section, is kind of granite with sand over it. And the more that it gets rutted, the dangerous it gets with climbing, or not, you're not climbing, but you're hiking up this hill that you have to be careful going up or down because sand on rock, you slip. So at least the first 10 minutes of this climb up is haphazard. I wouldn't say it's dangerous, but I would say that you really got to be mindful. And then occasionally you got to be mindful that the person coming around the corner is on his bike and probably has his earphones set in. Tell you this though, anything's better than the bump and grind. And I'm sorry I say that because I know that probably most of you guys do the bump and grind. I hate the bump and grind. So, but we're going to get ready to climb that next section. This is a steep section. But what's beautiful about it is now you get even a better view down into the Indian Canyons. This is the area where you see Andreas Canyon, you see Murray Canyon, and San Jacinto is just absolutely beautiful. Boy, we made it up to the top of that, and trust me, if you're not taking a break, you're a better person than I am, because at that point, we're all sitting down, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the animals through there. Now, with the animals that we have in the Coachella Valley, there are some animals that are primarily towards the hills areas. Chuckawalla, you pretty much are going to find the largest lizard in the Coachella Valley in the southwest, not counting we don't have Gila monsters, up in the rock areas of the foothills. You also see up in the foothills bighorn sheep. There are mule deer out here. Seen them in the back areas through here, seen them over in Morongo. We have, of course, coyotes. We have gray fox. They are so pretty. Beautiful creatures, bobcat, and occasionally a mountain lion. I'm asked about what scares me on a trail. There are only 2 things that scare me on a trail. It's not a rattlesnake, because as long as I'm not dumb and picking it up and doing a selfie, or stepping on a snake that doesn't have arms or legs to kick me off, I don't have really a lot of fear. I have a lot of respect for rattlesnakes. What scares me is this. Fortunately, I can't even remember a mountain lion attack ever happening down here. But I am aware and keep in mind that there are mountain lions out here. The number one thing that scares me, people. Tell you what, 99% of hikers are awesome. It's that 1% that are not so awesome. And maybe out of the last 5 years, it's gotten a little more crazy. But those are the 2 things that really concern me. But as these animals, all these animals here, we live in such a harsh environment. If you think about it, we're really fortunate. Our adaptations is, if it's hot outside, we're going to go inside and turn the air conditioning on. If it's cold outside, we're going to go inside and we're going to turn the heating on. A lot of animals don't have that capability unless they're your pooch and sneaking in the house with you. But adaptations are what keeps these animals together. And a perfect one. And I would share the kangaroo rat, but it is the perfect one because it can go through its entire life without ever taking a drink of water. If there's water there, it will drink, but it gets all of its water that it needs through seeds and plants. But another really great one that has the ability to adapt very well has ear conditioning. Not air conditioning, ear conditioning. It has these long ears that actually, when they rise up, there's tons of blood vessels in them, and the wind, like on a day like this, would hit those ears, cool down the blood, and it would circulate through their body and help keep them cool. And this little guy right here, like a kangaroo rat, can eat its food, and out of that, extract its water. Eventually, it'll need some water again. And I know this is probably a family program, but if it can't find any food, it'll eat its poo. And it has these really furry feet that protect it in the summertime. Jackrabbits are quite extraordinary creatures. It's interesting that many people at first take, when they're looking at a jackrabbit, and I see tons of them up in this particular trail area, is that they look at those ears and they think to themselves, with those type of ears, we'll get the video playing, they got to hear better. It has nothing to do, honestly, with hearing. It's those blood vessels. In fact, if you look into the video, you'll see a little bit of that red that's kind of transparent as the sun hits it, and that helps keep that animal cool. So we've taken a break. We only have one more section to go on to get up to Murray Peak. We're doing really well. You guys feel rested? All right, let's go on. So CLARA Burgess, which is also one of the desert riders, we are at a point that where we're stationed at, there's a little bit of a dip as after we've done all this climbing up. And if you look down to one side, you're actually looking into kind of the washout that goes down into the Indian canyons. And it's beautiful because if you turn around, you have all the city on one side, and you turn over to the other side, and it's just all open land. And there's something that is incredible that, and they even experience it a little bit over in the Indio Hills area, that you're consumed by sound and city on one side, and literally walk on the other side of the hill, and it's just open and empty. And you get that same experience as you're getting ready to head up to Murray Peak. This is the last climb that we have to do, because after that, we're going downhill. And we're going up to a peak that, once again, that it's phones, GPS, and all that other stuff. It's just a little under 2,200 feet elevation. And you get to the top, and what you're greeted with is 4 picnic tables, maybe 5, maybe a bighorn sheep sitting there at the picnic tables. No. And you're greeted with a view that is outstanding. You have from Palm Springs, San Gorgonio, you can see out towards the San Andreas Fault. From there, Joshua Tree National Park, going all the way down to the east end of the valley. Behind you, you have the rolling hills of Santa Rosa, and it is outstanding. And the best part of it is you made it. Now you just got to find your way back home again. There is a trail that will take you in a full loop, but we're going to come right back down on the GARSTIN Trail. You know, I'm thinking, to just jump back for a second, you're standing on this hill, and you really kind of take in the elevation and the accomplishment of what you've done, that you've hiked up to this point. But, you know, the way my mind works is I go through my mind and I go, I want to know how old these hills are. Where did they come from? How did they rise? So I'm going to share a little bit of that with you. And Santa Rosas are actually connected over to San Jacinto. They're not as old as San Jacinto, but here's the weird thing. When we look at the Coachella Valley, if I look towards Desert Hot Springs and I see the little San Bernardinos, I think, oh, they're little hills. They can't be that old. That mountain over there, that's got to be really, really old. And the interesting thing is it's actually reversed. San Jacinto is about 5 million years old. The rock is about 70 to 120 million years old. But the rock was deep down in the ground. In fact, if I jump to the next slide, there was a period of time that the San Andreas Fault didn't exist. And actually what happened was we had the Pacific plate dropping underneath the continental plate, which pushed this huge amount of magma up close to the surface, didn't quite get to the top, cooled very slowly, and we have granite under all this pressure. So a lot of this rock was underground. So the question is, how did it actually start rising up? We had a period of time, somewhere between 5 million years ago to about 21 million years ago, that Baja California was right here. It would have been great. We could, finish this up and just get on our boat and water ski back and forth. That changed, and that's a whole nother lecture down the road. But this rock that remained in the ground, there was an earthquake fault that pushed it up. Everybody thinks about San Andreas Fault. If you guys are not thinking about San Andreas Fault, why are you really in California? I mean, think about it. At least once a year, we get the news story that this is going to shake apart, the houses are going to sink, and everybody in Desert Hot Springs is going to have beachfront property. It's not actually going to happen that way at all, but it'll be a big quake. It's been asleep for a long time, at least the south section of the San Andreas Fault. But there's another fault, the San Jacinto Fault. The San Jacinto Fault is right behind us. It's actually on the other side of Santa Rosa. This particular earthquake fault is going off all the time. In fact, the earthquakes that we had a couple months ago that were up behind La Quinta and out in Anza, that's part of the San Jacinto Fault. And the San Jacinto Fault behaves differently than the San Andreas Fault. San Andreas Fault, you're kind of going out this way. So part of Palm Springs, if I remember right, I think Palm Springs is heading towards Mexico. Sorry guys, you're going to Mexico. And Desert Hot Springs is eventually going to end up in San Francisco. But San Jacinto Fault doesn't behave that way. San Jacinto Fault is what we call a reverse fault. It's actually pushing up. Give you an example how that works, and this is a very temperamental slide. So we're going to see if it bounces in. That's good. Let's see if it'll actually work. So what happens with every little earthquake, it's pushing up. Give you an example, as I do with the schools, is that it's growing the length of your fingernail. San Jacinto and the Santa Rosas are growing the length of your fingernail in 1 year. So if 5 million years, if you could live for 5 million years and didn't cut your toe fingernail, and you let it out, it would be 10,834 feet long. That would be a mess. But that's the length that it's growing. And so these mountains, in a way, are kind of alive. They are still growing around us. All right, we've had a good time, and it's time to complete our entire hike. If you had a good time, did you feel like you went on a journey? All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through the whole visual of this trail. We're going to start back at the bottom, go all the way to the top, and come all the way back down again. And this trail, the one that I just shared with you, the GARSTIN to Murray Peak, sits at 7.1, so about 7.1, 7.2 miles. It depends on who you're hiking with and how their phones are working. I'll give you an example. My friend, Mark Glassman, raise your hand. Mark's there. Mark hikes with me, and we both measure our maps to our phone. Mine will say 7.1. His says 10.8. Everyone in the group goes with 10.8. 7.1. So we're going to start out right where it says no dogs are welcome. And we're going to make that climb up. All right, next big climb. We know we're getting closer. We made it to the picnic tables. We're heading back down, all downhill from there. Enjoy the sights and the view, and my recommendation is on a day like this, don't do this hike. The nice thing about this back section early in the morning, even this time of the year, is that it's usually in the shade until about 10 o'clock because the Santa Rosas are blocking through that area. Now, when I first, and it kind of gives you the viewpoint right there if you're a kilometers kind of person, but I also have the miles. I really wanted to, once again, share the idea of hiking. It's really hard to take people on a journey when you're actually keeping them in their chairs. But it's inspiring to step outside and to enjoy nature. I'm going to share with you very quickly a couple of the different routes that, once again, you can take up to Murray Peak. You have this one right through here, which is the Goats Trail over on, once again, by the Rimrock Trail. Much longer, higher elevation to climb. And I tell you what, that front entrance of Murray Peak is a switchback that goes like this. But the other difficulty of going in this direction is by the time that you're going up and you're happy, you're starting to go back down, realizing you're going to have to go back up again. Not my favorite way to go that direction. The Araby Trail, it's always fun to go by Bob Hope's house, which actually there was a sign there for a long period of time that says Bob Hope's dead. This is not his house. But that's kind of a fun area to hike up through, and you hit the Goats Trail. You just got to make sure that you're going on the right trail through there. Bogart Trail. This is actually one of the easier ones to go up through. It kind of starts on a dirt road and then eventually heads up to a trail. And a little less elevation gain than going on the GARSTIN Trail. And if you were to do a loop, people love loops. Every time I take people out hiking, they're like, "Are we going on a loop?" And it's like, "No, we're going straight back." And they're kind of like frowning, It must be our animal thing is that we got to chase our tail. But anyway, People like loops. So there is the way of going on that loop on the GARSTIN Trail. You can take portions of the Goats Trail and the Araby and all those connections through there and the Burns Trail and make that full loop. You can see the miles through there compared back over to GARSTIN. So a lot of different ways. I'm not even going to share the Art Smith Trail because it would be, if I'm putting you on the Art Smith Trail over to Murray Peak, I'll never see you again anyway. I'm going to leave you a couple final thoughts, which is really important to me because it's not appropriate to talk about hiking without talking about a little bit of hiking safety. I mean, pretty much everyone here raised their hand that they're hikers. Some of this is going to sound redundant, but us hikers also know that there are many times that we turn on the news and we see hikers that have gotten themselves into very, very serious trouble. And some of these individuals are professional hikers. So a couple of my first 4 rules that are exceedingly important to me. I love the 1 bottle of water. The 1 bottle of water where someone starts their hike and they're walking with their 1 bottle of water and they drank it all and they go, oh, I guess I should head back now. As I tell kids all the time at school, if you had that 1 bottle of water and you drank it because you were thirsty, don't you think you're going to be thirsty walking back and now it's later in the day? So the 1 bottle of water, my rule is 3 bottles of water. I know people say 3 liters. I put them in separate bottles because when I finish the first bottle, I have the second bottle to take me back. And if it's more than likely like today where we started in the 60s and ended up close to 90, I'm probably going to go through the 3rd bottle. So it's just good common sense. Number 2, I've been hiking almost every day for years now. I never hike alone. Now, I know that ruins the idea of solitude and peacefulness and running away from people. I know that. I truly know that. But I also know this. I'm going to pull this apart. This is not my savior. This is not my salvation. There are too many canyons, too many hills where having this will just not work. It's too easy to walk down the trail, hit a rock, and break your foot. It's too easy to not pay attention where you're doing, and I've seen this a lot. People fall off a mountain. It's too easy to, even with your bottle of water on a day like this, to have your body overheat and go into heat exhaustion, and once you go into heat stroke, your brain is scrambled. A lot of times they'll find hikers that have gone through heat stroke, they've taken off all of their clothes and they've walked in circles. Their brains are just gone. So I'm telling you, I'm not preaching to you, that you should always at least have one other hiker, and have them walk in front of you so they take care of the rattlesnakes for you. Number 3, even with people hiking with you, there should always be someone who knows where your group is going. There should always be someone who knows that you're checking back in. Even I occasionally make the mistake of not thinking this one through. I've been asked all the time by kids, have you ever been lost? Well, I'm here today. But it's good that somebody knows where you're at and where you're going. As beautiful as our weather is, we know it gets hot here, and in the summertime, if we're up in the mountains, it takes 20 minutes for a thundercloud to come over you, and literally you're washed out. Trail can be washed out. So it's good to let people know where you're going. The rest of the rules are pretty darn easy. Know what your weather's going to be like. Know the condition of the people that you're hiking with. It's not the situation that I'm looking at a hike and going, you better keep up with me. If you're going in that mindset, you're going to be a solo hiker. It's knowing your group and how far they can go too. It's being honest with your group and letting them know that maybe this trail is too hard for you. A first aid kit. I always have a first aid kit. You don't know how many hikers I've hiked with that got so excited to look at a cholla cactus and got too excited to be right next to it. My tweezers have been whittled down with the amount of cholla cactus that we've pulled out. And these things are important. It's important that you go out and you enjoy your outdoor environment. Man, I can't say this enough, we are blessed to live in the Coachella Valley and all these extraordinary places that we can go to. And then my final, before we open up into Q&A, I'd just like to think about a couple groups that really, especially when it comes to Murray Peak, they need to be recognized. The Desert Riders, once again, without what they contributed in years past, we would probably be half the trails that we see and explore and enjoy out through here. The Friends of the Mountains, where the Desert Riders over the years have gone out and done their own thing now. The Friends of the Mountains are extraordinary. If you have, if a trail's eroded, it might take some time, but one day you'll be walking up that trail. And I cannot remember this lady's name. But she's always out there with her little shovel and her little hoe, and they're cleaning those trails up. They're putting those trails back together. They are a phenomenal group. The Bureau of Land Management, they're the ones that manage the lower section of the Santa Rosa Mountain area. And of course, the U.S. Forestry manages the upper area. The Agua Caliente Kuya Indians, because I tell you this, they worked with the Desert Riders in the beginning in those trails. It would have been really easy that anything on their reservation they would have said, you can't go to. They are caring and passionate for their canyons. Tahquitz was a disaster area back in the 70s and 80s, and they have cleaned that place up, and it is worth every dollar that you pay to go in and see it. They take pride and ownership in their canyons. And I tell you what, if you're going to be rescued, as I put this last group down, and really they belong all the way up the top, is the Palm Springs Mounted Police Search and Rescue, because they're the ones that are going out finding those missing hikers, those individuals who have had heat exhaustion, the one who picked up the rattlesnake and decided to do a selfie with it. They are the ones out there that are making the rescues. I hope you've enjoyed this program. This has been fun. This has been really fun. I appreciate it. Thank you so much.